July, the hottest week in years. You head downstairs. The air changes before you reach the bottom step. Not the window unit running in the back bedroom. Not the calm ceiling fan 2 floors up that you left on before you left for work. Something in the walls themselves. The floor, the room. You have felt this your whole life and never had a word for it. Your house was doing something, and in all the years you have lived there, nobody ever told you what. This video is for you specifically. If you own a house built before 1955, if you grew up in one, if your grandparents had one that always felt different in summer than every new house you have been inside since. Most homeowners with an old house have been told the same thing their whole lives. The house is drafty. It needs updates. The basement is wasted space. The walls are inefficient. The ceilings are too high. The heating bills are too much. You should finish that basement. You should insulate those walls. You should modernize. Every one of those suggestions would have disabled the system, because the old house is not failing at being a modern home. The modern home is failing at doing what the old house was already doing and has been doing without your help since the year it was built. The house was built to cool itself, and sometime around 1965, the people who built houses in America decided to stop doing that. Subscribe to the floor plan and tell us in the comments, did you grow up in a house that felt different in summer? We want to know exactly what you noticed. Before 1950, fewer than 1 in 10 American homes had any form of mechanical cooling. No window unit, no central air, no refrigerant cycling through ducts pressed into 8-foot ceilings. What they had instead was a house designed to work with temperature rather than fight it. The 1910 farmhouse in central Ohio, the 1922 Foursquare in Minneapolis with its deep covered porch, the 1935 Craftsman bungalow in Portland, set on its lot with the long axis running east to west, the dominant windows facing south in winter and shaded by the porch overhang in summer. None of that orientation was an aesthetic preference. It was thermal engineering, carried out by builders who learned it from builders who learned it from builders who had no other option. Each house was built around the same set of principles, passed down through tradespeople the way a recipe passes through a family. Never written in a manual, never codified in a textbook, understood because the previous generation understood it, and the generation before that. 10-foot ceilings were standard in pre-1940 residential construction. Not for visual grandeur, hot air rises, and a ceiling that sat 10 feet up kept the accumulated heat of the afternoon above the heads of the people living below it. The air at 5 feet off the ground in a 10-foot room is measurably cooler than the same volume of air in a room with an 8-foot ceiling on the same July afternoon. That gap mattered before air conditioning existed. Transom windows, small panes of glass or operable louvers cut into the wall above interior doorways, allowed air to circulate from room to room without opening exterior windows to the heat outside. Every room in the circuit contributed to the airflow loop running through the whole house. Windows were positioned on opposing walls, oriented toward the prevailing wind direction specific to that region of the country. West-facing covered porches extended far enough to block the afternoon sun from reaching the walls of the house during the hours between noon and 4, the peak heat load of every summer day. Large attic fans were set into the floor of the attic space, pulling a column of cool night air up through the entire building and exhausting the heat stored in the structure through vented gable ends. These 5 systems worked in concert, and most pre-1940 builders could install them from memory. But of all the systems built into a pre-1950 American house, one was doing the heaviest work. Most homeowners walked past it every single day without knowing what it was. The concrete floor at the bottom of those stairs, the bare walls, the low vent cut into the north-facing foundation, 6 inches above grade, The second vent set near the ceiling on the opposite wall. None of that was unfinished construction. None of it was an oversight waiting for a renovation budget. Here is what the Earth below the frost line actually does. It holds a constant temperature of 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of what happens on the surface above it. Whether it is July in Iowa or January in Vermont, the ground at that depth has absorbed the thermal average of every season for thousands of years and equalized. It does not change in summer. It does not change in winter. A basement with uninsulated concrete walls and an exposed concrete floor maintains direct thermal contact with that earth. During the day, the mass of the concrete absorbs heat from the air in the house and conducts it downward into the ground. After midnight, as surface temperatures fall, the slab releases that stored heat slowly into the room. On a 90-degree July afternoon, the floor of an active pre-1940 basement sits between 58 and 63 degrees Fahrenheit. The walls, uninsulated and in contact with soil, sit close to the same range. That is the first mechanism, thermal mass. The second is older than the concept of a house. Cold air is denser than warm air. It sinks. Warm air rises toward any opening it can reach. When the door at the top of the basement stairs stands open, the cool air pooled at the basement floor flows out at ground level, displacing the warmer air in the first floor rooms above it. That displaced air rises toward the ceiling, moves toward the attic vents, and exits the building. The basement floor continuously feeds cool air into the base of the stack. The attic vents continuously exhaust warm air from the top. The house breathes from the bottom up, a passive circulation driven by nothing more than the weight difference between two columns of air at different temperatures. The stack effect. No moving parts, no electricity, no monthly bill, no filter to replace in March. The cool air the basement produced was not the same as the cool air from a window unit. A window unit drops the temperature of the room directly around it and fights the heat load of the whole house from one corner. The cool air from the basement floor arrived at the base of every room on the first floor simultaneously and rose through the full column of living space as it warmed. The house cooled from the ground up, the same way it heated in winter, by managing the vertical distribution of air rather than forcing a temperature change into a single point and hoping it spreads. The third mechanism ran through those two small vents cut into opposite walls. Outside air enters at the low point on the north wall, where the foundation sits in shadow through the hottest hours of the day. That air is cooler than the room it enters. It absorbs heat from the concrete mass, becomes slightly less dense, rises, and exits through the high vent on the opposite wall. A passive airflow loop operating on temperature differential alone, 24 hours a day without a switch or a timer or any human input at all. Americans had been storing food in root cellars using this exact principle for 200 years before the houses around them grew large enough to apply it to the whole building. The cold room dug into a hillside, the stone cellar under the kitchen floor, the narrow steps down to where the apples and salt pork and sealed jars kept through winter without spoiling. These were not primitive solutions waiting to be replaced by refrigeration. They were the same thermodynamic logic, earth coupling and passive ventilation, scaled to a storage room. The American basement was that room expanded to the full footprint of the house. The cool basement was not a byproduct of deep foundations dug against the frost line. American houses were built around it. The numbers confirm what memory suggested. Fewer than 10% of American homes had mechanical cooling of any kind in 1950. The Earth below the frost line in northern states holds at 50 to 55 degrees year-round, a figure verified by the Department of Energy and consistent across every climate zone in the country where basements are common. On a 90-degree day, a functioning pre-1940 basement with intact venting and uninsulated walls maintains 58 to 63 degrees at floor level. That is a 27 to 32 degree differential from the outdoor temperature. No electricity required. The first home air conditioning unit cost the equivalent of $14,000 in today's dollars to install in 1929. The passive cooling system in an old house cost $0. It was already built in. Willis Carrier invented modern mechanical air conditioning in 1902, not to cool a home, but to control humidity in a printing factory in Buffalo, New York, where paper was warping from summer moisture. The entire residential cooling industry that followed was built on technology designed for a factory floor, retrofitted to a problem that American houses had already solved a different way. And in 1931, S.M. Anderson of the B.F. Sturtevant Company presented a formal engineering proposal, a basement-type central system that would use the earth-coupled thermal mass below the house as the primary cooling source, eliminating the need for mechanical refrigeration entirely. He was not describing a folk solution. He was presenting a formalized version of what the best residential builders in America had already been practicing for 50 years, written up as an industry standard ready for adoption at scale. The proposal was on the table. The engineering was proven. Then, 1947 arrived. In 1947, Henry Galson introduced a compact window air conditioning unit, affordable enough for residential installation. That year alone, 43,000 units sold. By 1950, fewer than 1 in 10 American homes had any mechanical cooling. By the late 1960s, most new homes were built with central air as a standard included feature. By 1980, more than half of all American households had it. The Department of Energy today puts that number at 87%. What changed in those 30 years was not just the hardware. The post-war housing boom, Levittown, New York, opened in 1947, and the tens of thousands of subdivisions built in its image across the following decade was built on speed and scale. Concrete slabs poured directly onto grade, no excavation, no below-grade space, no basement, no root cellar, no earth-coupled thermal mass, no stack-effect engine room. The slab-on-grade foundation was faster, cheaper, and structurally simpler than any foundation that required digging. A single crew could pour it in a day. It also eliminated every mechanism that had cooled American houses for a century and a half. No basement meant no thermal battery, no passive vent system, no below-grade air column to feed the stack effect upward through the house. Home design. Decoupled from thermodynamics for the first time in the history of residential construction. Houses no longer needed to face a specific compass direction. Windows could prioritize views instead of prevailing winds. Ceiling heights dropped from 10 feet to 8 because there was no longer any thermal reason to hold heat above head level. The passive cooling system disappeared not from a single decision, but from the accumulation of thousands of small ones, each made on the confident assumption that electricity would stay cheap, refrigerant would stay available, and mechanical cooling was the permanent and final answer. Which part of that strikes you harder? That it worked, or that we stopped building it? Leave it in the comments. And the knowledge? It was never written in a manual. It lived in the tradespeople who framed and finished pre-war American houses, the carpenters who knew to leave the basement vents in specific positions, the builders who understood that an uninsulated foundation wall was a thermal feature and not an oversight waiting for drywall. That generation retired through the 1960s and the 1970s. The generation that replaced them learned to size ductwork, the two-vent system, the propped door, the night flush, the attic cupola with its operable windows above the open stair hall. These were not documented anywhere. They passed out of the industry the way a language passes when its last native speakers die, without announcement, without anyone deciding it was over, without the people who came after knowing what they had stopped doing. But the houses built before 1955, the system is still in them. It never stopped running. If your house was built before 1955 and you have a basement, go downstairs on a July afternoon and put your hand flat on the concrete floor. It will be cold, not cool. Cold. That is the earth at 55 degrees drawing heat out of the slab through direct conduction. The thermal mass doing what it was designed to do, without your awareness, without your electricity, without you. Find the low vent on the north-facing wall. Find the high vent across from it. If they are open and unobstructed, air is moving through that basement right now. It moved through yesterday. It has moved through every summer since the house was built. Open the door at the top of the stairs. The cool air from the basement floor will begin displacing the warm air on the first floor above. Within 20 minutes, the temperature near the floor of the kitchen drops 2 to 3 degrees. Within an hour, depending on the size of the house and the differential outside, that drop extends upward through the room. Now think about every habit someone in your family had around that house that seemed strange or arbitrary at the time. The basement door left open all summer long. That was the stack effect running. Whoever kept it open understood that door as the switch that activated the whole circulation system, opening every window after dark and closing them tight before 10 in the morning. That was a night flush, drawing cool night air through the thermal mass of the building overnight and sealing the accumulated cold inside before the day's heat built up outside. A box fan in the basement, always pointed upward. That was deliberate stack effect assistance. The fan doubled the airflow rate through the passive circulation loop without requiring any ducts or refrigerant. Never running the furnace fan in summer, even on the worst days. That was protecting the temperature gradient the whole system depended on. The furnace fan mixes everything. Warm upper floor air with cool lower floor air, and destroys the stratification. Running it in summer is the thermal equivalent of opening a sealed cooler. None of those habits were superstitions passed down for unclear reasons. They were the operating procedures for a passive cooling system that the person following them had absorbed without ever hearing the words thermal mass or stack effect in their lives. That is what was lost when the tradespeople retired, not the systems. They are still inside the houses, working right now. The knowledge of how to run them. The old house your neighbors call outdated was doing something their house physically cannot do. Not cannot do efficiently, cannot do at all. A slab-on-grade foundation has no earth-coupled thermal mass, no below-grade air column to feed the stack effect. The architecture that makes this system work requires below-grade concrete in direct contact with earth at constant temperature and a vertical air path from that mass to the top of the house. Post-war construction eliminated both in one design decision. There is a reason the architects designing the most thermally efficient new homes built anywhere in the world today. And the passive house movement that began in Germany in the 1990s and is now written into building codes across Northern Europe, have spent 30 years reconstructing exactly this system from first principles. Thermal mass, earth coupling, controlled passive ventilation, stack effect circulation. They did not invent it, they found it again. Every house built before Eisenhower was president had this system running inside it. The house that looked old had the answer. The house that looked new spent 70 years burning money to approximate what a propped door and 55-degree concrete had already solved. That is not nostalgia. That is engineering. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe to The Floor Plan.